Good evening, everyone. We continue from where we left off yesterday, now with verse 23. In that elaborate arrangement between Jonathan and David, how Jonathan would signal to David, and which signal it means what, whether it is safe for him to come out or whether he should run away. But this is the agreement. In verse 23, we read this as uh, an agreement, but the Hebrew word is still davar. As you know, davar is the issue. It's got a broad application of meanings. So this would be something which they spoke about and they had an agreement. That would be that's a very good way of expressing it in English, anyways, which you and I have spoken. So this would be as for the words of which you and I have spoken. And so the words that were spoken was about how to arrange for this signal while David would go and hide in the fields near the stone of Aval. So, verse 24, David went to hide himself in the field. When the new moon came, the king sat down to eat food. Now, this idea of eat food is somewhat of a celebration of the new moon. Now, in those days, you would find that there is no electronic calendar, there's no iPhone to tell when the moon is going down or coming up. So they would have to look at the moon. So we need to understand that this is the month. And as the moon, the full moon, came smaller and smaller, and then it disappears. And then the new moon comes out and becomes bigger and bigger. So the idea here is they were to look for this particular point in time in between at the disappearing of the moon. And when the moon disappears, it will appear again. And so they had this visual view of the new moon because there is always a small sliver of moon. Now, in the skies of Israel, uh, it generally are clear skies. At least we can see clear skies now. And with a clear sky, you can actually spot the moon. It's very unlike our place here, that there are no street lights and no city lights. So the sky is practically absolutely clear. And that's how they can actually find the new moon. And so when that time comes, they are going to have this celebration. The king would sit on his seat as usual. Now, understand the seats, if we are careful to understand, these are all couches. All right. They are all couches, and these are all recliners. And so you find that they are recliners. And they would recline in a semicircle of sorts. Okay. And basically, you find these are recliners. So we would see this reclining this way. You could have a table. And so we find the first one being Saul. So Saul sat down and took his seat, the seat by the wall. And so we could then draw in the wall. That would be the wall. Then Jonathan rose up and Abner sat down by Saul's side. but David's place was empty. Now we could actually put in another one right here, where it would be something like this. We've got the head rest, and this would be the incline. Okay, so we could have David's here, and we could have Jonathan would be here, and Avner would sit here. Now, what is important was we are now trying to picture how the layout goes. So we have 4 couches or chairs, and we can determine Saul's, we can determine Avner, and then we can determine Jonathan, and David would also sit next to Saul, and Jonathan is sitting across from Saul. Now, that is how we would think of the layout to be, right? The layout. So let's go to verse 26. In verse 26, Saul did not speak anything that day, for he thought, what do you mean he didn't speak anything? It's not that Saul didn't say anything. It means that Saul didn't make any remarks or ask anything about David. And so this whole aspect is about David, right? About David. So he says, it is an incident, he is not clean. Now, this word here in verse 26, it is not an accident, right? It's not an accident. This word here literally means there is something that happened. Something that happened. There was an incident. It could be something negative, and hence the translator decides to decide that it's an accident. But it doesn't have to be an accident. It's something, it's an incident in Saul's mind, that something could have happened that made him not clean. So he failed to be clean, or this would be ceremonially clean. And he has to wait until the evening. So Saul was just wondering, why wasn't he here to eat? And in Saul's mind, David was not there because he must have done something to make himself unclean. And since he's unclean, he is not here to eat until the evening. And so Saul just let it be. So that would be the meaning of verse 26. Now, there are speculations as to what that unclean incident may be, but since we don't have it, so no point speculating. It's just that Saul must have thought about something, and it was deemed that it was unclean. So in verse 27, he was patient enough to wait till the next day. So this is the second day of the new moon. Now understand this, there's going to be a 3-day affair. When it says it's a 3-day affair, we have the first day, the second day, and the third day. And they were talking about the 3 days, right? They had planned it here, David and Jonathan. And that night, David didn't show up. And so the next day, David's place was still empty. And so Saul asked Jonathan, his son, why has the son of Jesse not come to the meal either yesterday or today? It's time to eat. Why did he not come? And so Jonathan said, remember, this was a test. If this test is successful and Saul was feeling good or told about it, then there would be a signal. If Saul thinks of something bad or ra'ah, then there would be a different signal. And so here comes the test for Saul. So Jonathan answers Saul, says, David earnestly asked me for me to go to Bethlehem. Why go to Bethlehem? Well, let's read verse 29. For David said, please let me go, since our family has a sacrifice in the city of Bethlehem, and my brother has, well, insisted, I would say, in verse 29, to tell me to go. And now, if I have found favor in your sight, Jonathan's sight, please let me get away that I may see my brother. So understand, we talked about this before. This is grace. Grace is in the eyes of the beholder. And so you need to find grace in the eyes of the beholder before you can be extended grace. Now, that's the Hebrew context. And so it says, for this reason, David has not come to the king's table. And here comes the test. Now, did Saul pass that test? We read in verse 30. And Saul began to be hot in the nose. The anger burn literally says was hot in the nose. So the nose is the part of the body that indicates anger. It is as if that, the nose gets hot, it's red, and then the smoke coming out, kind of imagery. And so that is what it means, literally, at least in the Hebrew. Then Saul's nose was very hot. And it burned against Yehonathan, and that would be Jonathan. And Saul said to him, and these are very nasty words, I would say, you son of a perverse, rebellious, well, it doesn't say woman, right? It doesn't say woman. So let me just put this in brackets. But it does imply you son of a perverse, rebellious, and all this is in the feminine. And so by implication, it talks about Jonathan, the son of a perverse and loose woman, naming the mother, right? Naming the mother. We don't know much of the mother. This is probably one of the rare occasions we get a glimpse in the anger of Saul. Everything came out. Do I not know that you are choosing the son of Jesse to your own shame? Now, this is important, to your own shame. Boshet is something that is very shameful, right? Very shameful. And to the shame of your mother's nakedness. And so let's break this down. The first word is choosing. You have chose. Now, understand this word, Bachar, means to examine and decide. And that is what choosing means. It's like choosing durians, right? You've got to look, smell, shake, and make your careful examination before you decide which durians you're going to buy. So this is that word. In the Hebrew, Bachar, although in simple English word means to choose, you need to realize that this word really means to examine carefully. Examine carefully. And what is there to examine? Well, you need to know that Jonathan would have compared Saul to David. David with other people. But at the end of the day, Jonathan loves David as his own nephesh, which means that David is closer to Jonathan than Saul, the father, could ever be. Even though we say that in Oriental terms, Blood is thicker than water. A blood relationship is always tighter than a friendship. But we have demonstrated that Jonathan and David is not mere bosom buddies. The way that Jonathan, the older of the two, expressed that relationship is that David is like his nephesh, is like himself, basically. And so Saul says, don't you think I know that you have chosen David to be shameful uh your shameful event is your idol, right? I think you can say this. When he talks about shame, it talks about something of an idol, of idolatry. You are treating David closer than your father, and to the shame of your mother's nakedness. Now, nakedness here also means something shameful. Something shameful. And that has to do with the father. Your mother's nakedness in this context is the father. It's something shameful of the mother. And your very own shame is to choose David over the father. And so it's like treating David as an idol, right? Considered something shameful. And so what Saul was trying to say is this, that I know that you have chosen the son of Jesse. So number one, to your own shame, you're treating him like an idol. The shame of your mother's nakedness is extremely shameful. And if it applies to the mother, it is the shame of the mother. But now you've got a double word here, the shame of your mother's shame. Literally means the father. I would take it as the father. And so Saul is particularly upset that his own son had chosen somebody else's son over himself. And that in itself has caused Saul to be even more incensed. Even more incensed. Verse 31. Saul is now, when a person is angry and so angry, you find that the things that is bothering him, but he has kept to himself, suddenly bursts out in the open. So it says, for as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, not in on the earth, on the soil, the soil of Israel. If he is alive on this soil, and we're talking about David, as long as David is there, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Now, what does that mean? It means that Saul is harboring the hope that he could actually prevent David from taking over the kingdom. But he doesn't know how God is going to establish the kingdom. Now, if God doesn't establish the kingdom, Saul is trying to make it happen himself. And so his concern was for Jonathan. He says, you are going to be the next king. But yet Saul knows that his dynasty will not continue to be king. And there will be no kingdom for Jonathan. That Saul's reign must come to an end. God has already left him and left him alone, that he will not have God's guidance in the kingdom. But Saul was concerned that he's wanting to protect that for his dynasty, protect it for Jonathan. So therefore now, Saul says, send him and bring him to me, for he must surely die. This means that he must surely be put to death, right? put to death. Now, how do you think Jonathan would feel? In our previous chapter, uh, and as well as this earlier verse, right? In the earlier verse and the previous chapter, we find that Jonathan is very sure, since Saul has sworn by the name of God that no harm will come to David. And then he got crazy. He tried to kill David. And in the earlier chapters of chapter 20, Jonathan still does not believe that Saul is harboring any evil against David. But things are quickly changing. And so here in verse 31, he hears that Saul says he must die, when in chapter 19 says he will not die. So what has happened is that Saul is not saying everything to Jonathan. And so Jonathan asks his father and said to him, why should he be put to death? Why? What has he done? Now understand this. The idea of put to death is a idea of a judgment that is worthy of the death penalty. And so Jonathan asks, what has he done to deserve this? And that really flies in the face of Saul, because Saul is king. He thinks that, no, if I said it, it must happen. So it doesn't matter what the reason may be, but this is his son asking him. And look at the reaction in verse 33. Saul hurled his spear at him to strike him down. And what happened, you can see I've purposely left this picture here. And Saul right here, tries to kill Jonathan, who is right here. Now, understand that, well, maybe not quite there. Let me just remove this. We're saying that Jonathan is trying to kill, Saul is trying to kill Jonathan, and Jonathan is here. And somewhere in between, he would have sat down, because he arose when Abner came. And then he would have sat down, because eventually he rose again. And so I'm saying that that's how I think Saul was trying to throw his spear against Jonathan. All right. So Jonathan knew that his father had decided to put David to death. Now, does it need to show that Saul is angry and try to throw the spear? This is all part of the narrative. So let us not read too much into the narrative, right? Not to read too much into the narrative. In verse 34, then Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger. So what happened when he threw the spear, right? When he threw the spear, he wanted to strike at Jonathan, but it did not hit Jonathan. The text didn't say that, but because we saw Jonathan arose from the table, he must have sat there as well. And he missed. He missed. So this is what we have to surmise from it. Saul missed Jonathan. And by that incident, Jonathan stood up from the table in fierce anger. He says, how dare you, father, that you try to kill me? So he did not eat food on that second day. So it is a time before they had started to eat. Because Saul was asking, where is David? Why is he not here for the meal? For he would be Jonathan. Jonathan was grieved. This word grieve is pained, right? He was pained. He was in pain. He was hurt over David. Why over David? Because his father had dishonored him. His father had humiliated him. Humiliated him, had shamed him. Had shamed him. And what about shaming him? This is regarding David. It wasn't so much as the spear thrown at him. Jonathan wasn't concerned about that. Jonathan was concerned that Jonathan had defended the honor of Saul before David. Jonathan was saying, it cannot be. God forbid his father would not do this to David. And David was sure that Saul would. And now in verse 34, Jonathan was hurt over David, regarding David, because his father had dishonored him and humiliated him and made him look bad, because everything David had suspected was true. Everything that Jonathan tried to defend and explain about his father was false. Verse 35. And it came about in the morning that Jonathan went out into the field for the appointment with David, and a little lad was with him. Now, in the morning, we're talking about the third day. And this is the day where he would have this secret message to be sent to David. Verse 36, he said to his lad, run, find now the arrows which I am about to shoot. Now, as we recall, yesterday we drew this picture, right? There was a bow and arrow, and it would have to be quite far away because there was a road, and next to the road would have been a rock, and on both sides would have been the fields. Would have been the fields, all right? And David would have tried to hide behind here somewhere. And so we have a lad that was going to run ahead. And then as he was running, Jonathan shot an arrow past him. And so this little chap was trying to run. And the arrow went way over. Now, let me just try to express that in a drawing. So this arrow went all the way here. Right? The arrow went all the way there. And so when the lad reached the place of the arrow which Jonathan shot, Jonathan called after the lad and said, is not the arrow beyond you? The way is beyond means that it is way past you. And then Jonathan called after the lad, hurry, be quick, do not stay. And lad picked up the arrow and came to his master. And so what we will try to imagine, what is happening is, as this chap went to pick up the arrow, Jonathan would have also gone there as well. And this is what we have to imagine, the narrative, right? Imagine that narrative. Now, the lad was not aware of anything. Not aware means he did not know. Not know. This word is know. He didn't know what was this arrangement. Only Jonathan and David knew about this matter of this arrow being shot. If it was shot far away beyond the lad, then that's it. No, that would be the signal to David. So Jonathan gave his weapons to the lad and said to him, go bring them to to the city or to the town. And so what we have to imagine that is going to happen now is this chap, right, where he's got the arrow as well. He is going to go back to the city with the arrow and with the bows. And off he goes to the city. And now we have Jonathan. Jonathan would have gone nearer to where David was. And so we would depict it this way, and let's draw in Jonathan. Jonathan would have come by, and David would have been just coming out of hiding. So in verse 41, these are our two last verses. In verse 41, when the lad was gone, so David rose, and this one rose is stood up. From the south side and fell on his face to the ground. This word would be fall down with his face to the ground. It would be fall down. The word here is not face. The word here is with nose to the ground. Although the English word says it's face, the Hebrew word is nose to the ground. Now, this would be the idea of, should I say? This would be something like this. This is prostrating. Now, why would he do that? Right? Why do he do that? So you have this. He fell on his face to the ground and bowed 3 times. This is the expression. He bowed down to the ground, or his face and nose to the ground, more the nose, not the face. But if the nose is to the ground, yes, the face would be also facing the ground. But what did he do was he bowed 3 times. Very similar to Chinese, isn't it? 3 times seems to be the number to really honor a person. And so he does this 3 times. He I would say in the Chinese concept, this would be a kowtow. 3 times. That's how in Chinese culture you do that. And after that, they kiss each other. And when they kiss each other, it could be well, I guess you could talk about kissing the cheek or kissing the lips. In those days, that is perfectly fine. And then they cried. Why? They cried. And David even more. This word wept is added in. It just says that, but David, the more, it was stronger. What is stronger? This, he was crying even harder. And so now we have 2 men hugging each other, crying with each other. This is to tell us that their bond is very tight, not just bosom buddy. And Jonathan treats David as his own nephesh, loved David as his own nephesh, as if David was himself. But now when they are crying, because the pact says this, if the father Saul was trying to kill David, this secret messaging using the arrow is to show him that it is time for David to leave and go in shalom. Do not come back. So Jonathan said to David, go in safety. walk, right? Walk to shalom. Walk to your peace. Walk to your safety. That would be fine. Inasmuch as we have sworn to each other in the name of the Lord, which means that it is formal, saying, the Lord will be between me and you. The Lord is the one who is binding the two of them. And also between my descendants and your descendants. And it says this, for eternity, forever. Now, you and I should know that this word is olam. Remember, there is no word called eternity or forever. It merely means a long, long time. How long, we don't know, but very long. And so this oath, right? The oath that David and Jonathan, so between me, Jonathan, and you, David, we have made this pact, and God has seen it, and it has to be between my descendants and your descendants for olam. Remember that you must have chesed. This is important because the promise is for chesed. We saw that yesterday, where the verse 15, and this would be chapter 20, verse 15. What is this oath? What is this promise? The promise is that you shall not cut off your chesed from my house forever. And this must be between the two of us. When it says for olam, even after David dies, whatever happens between the house of David, the descendants of David, must not harm the descendants of Jonathan. That's what it means for forever. As long as the two families are around, you must show your kindness, your chesed. That is the reminder. And why did he say that? Is because Jonathan and David now knows that they may not see each other again, because Saul is bent on killing David. So there is no way that the two of them can ever meet again. In that sense, that's why they were crying. It's like you leaving yourself. That's a very strange expression, but yes, David is like Jonathan's own nephesh, and your nephesh is about to leave you. It's as good as dying. That this relationship is going to be ending. They are not going to see each other anymore. But the promise made must hold, because God is the center of the oath, the center of the covenant, the center of the brit. That there must be chesed, that the house of David must extend to the house of Jonathan. That in itself is where they cherish each other. Then he arose and departed while Jonathan went into the city. He arose and departed means he left, he fled, and he escaped. And off they go. So if you were to look at the direction, Jonathan would have gone to the city and David would have gone away. So that would bring us to the end of chapter 20.